I mean, how was it her oil? She should know better, but the very entrance of foreign policy into her thinking totally obscured individualism. Of course, her followers, especially recently, have taken this, not all her followers, but many, and many of the most vocal ones, have taken this to a whole new level. Right after 9/11, there were calls for us, we were attacked by them, and we need to attack them back. Not just the hijackers, not even just the places that the hijackers came from, or the organizations in which they were members, but the entire Arab world, much of the Muslim world. Some called for nuking 9 or 10 countries. And of course, if the US actually did this, depending on how it came about, this could be the worst thing that ever happened in terms of individuals being killed. So there's something wrong here. Now, of course, belligerent nationalism, it doesn't just afflict the worst of the Randians, and it's been a problem for a long time. I would submit that belligerent nationalism has the capacity to produce the same human misery on the same scale as communism. And if you look at much of history, you know, it's countries fighting each other over nothing, over a few feet of territory that no one even wants to live there. And it's all about the nation state. Even communism took root in a lot of places that it probably would not have if it weren't for nationalist impulses. They had to play on that. It was supposed to be this internationalist philosophy, but it resulted in kind of a modern tribalism. It relied on it in order to really take root. Of course, belligerent nationalism, we've seen it totally corrupt most of the right, the conservative movement, certainly the Republican establishment. The Christian right has largely forgotten about the essential dignity of the individual that their faith upholds, and that's been so important to their tradition. And incidentally, many of them also seem to, in their calls for the empire to torture people, they seem to forget their savior was tortured to death by an empire. But I guess, I'm sure Lawrence will talk about this more, so I won't bash them any more than that. But even, you know, even the doves, even especially on the left, when they condemn the war, they do so largely from collectivist premises. You know, this is a national tragedy. Our national priorities have been pushed aside. The international community doesn't respect the US empire anymore, which incidentally I think is probably the best thing that's happened from this war. You know, and some of the left will criticize the fact that people profit off the war, which of course it's important to follow the money. I really believe that, but they'll criticize that more than the war itself. You know, it's like they don't like the privatization of the war, but if it were a totally socialist war, supposedly it'd be better. Of course, it would be less sustainable because the state does rely on a sector of capitalism to feed itself. So one of the silver linings of a totally socialist state is it's harder to kill people abroad, but it's not exactly what I want. So, but what is really at stake here when we're talking about war and empire? Well, what we're talking about is really the total negation of the individual. We're talking about a total assault on individual rights and dignity. And seeing as though many of us do believe it is from individual rights and dignity that civilization grows, what's at stake is civilization itself. And therefore, what's at stake is the greater good. To understand why the empire really does hurt the greater good, as most decent people would try to assess it, it is important to look at how it affects the individual. Let me begin with the beleaguered taxpayer. Now, each American is being soaked for thousands of dollars for this empire. And some would say it's almost trivial to mention this. And I don't think it's the worst thing about empire, but it's very significant. And it's funny that I actually, in Berkeley, I actually know some people on the left. And, they'll talk about, when I talk about the tax side of the state, sometimes they'll say this trivial. And yet the same people will complain about the national priorities being pushed aside by war. It's okay to say that with this money we could have Medicare 3 and Social Security 2 and build more public schools, but for some reason it's not okay to reflect on what would have happened if that money wasn't seized at all. I mean, think about what all of these taxpayers could have done. They could have invested in businesses, they could have saved, they could have spent more time with their families, they could have maybe moved somewhere, they could have gone on vacation, they could have retired earlier, they could have done 100 things that would help bolster civil society. And at worst, they probably wouldn't have been much of a menace to civil society. And of course, on average, everything they would have done would have been far better in promoting any sense of the greater good that I would care to promote. Of course, much of this taxation isn't direct, as Lou pointed out yesterday, or not just pointed out, but explained in some detail that a lot of this tax money that's seized is done so indirectly through the central bank and inflation and higher prices, and all of this benefits the corporate state and the fat cats who are connected to the military-industrial complex, and it hurts the average person. And this is also very bad for the greater good, as is the business cycle, which inflation will bring on eventually. Malinvestment, terrible things in the economy. And of course, the economy, the free economy in general, is under threat because of the war. I'd like to point out that even if we were to take the Great Society and the Progressive Era and the New Deal and all of these terrible things and erase them from history, and I don't think I underestimate how terrible some of these episodes were, our government would still be huge because of the warfare state. It was the wars that really brought on much of the control over the economy coming from Washington. It was the warfare state that created the institutions that later became resuscitated for the purpose of the New Deal, as Bob Higgs's work shows in great detail. And it was, incidentally, it was also the war that brought the precedents for such things as prohibition. And if you really look at it, almost everything we hate can be traced in one way or another to war. But the economy, as this abstraction that people talk about, is not really what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the individual. During war, the individual's liberty is pushed aside. In the market, this means we sometimes get price controls. We get command control of markets. We get socialization of the private sector, or corporatization, or kind of corporate socialization, whatever you want to call it. And we get all sorts of violations of civil liberties, as we're all aware. Those seen as enemies of the collective or insufficient supporters of the war collective are often targeted. They're smeared, their lives are ruined. They've sometimes been jailed in our history. As it is, they have trouble getting airline flights, as we know. This is a terrible thing.